October 18th, 1942. Paris, France. The streets are quiet, but not peaceful. The soft hum of distant conversations is swallowed by the heavy boots of German soldiers marching past storefronts draped in silence. The city, once alive with the fervor of revolution, is now a city shackled by fear. Beneath the gray sky, you can almost feel the weight of it, the weight of the years, the weight of history, the weight of all those crushed by the boot of occupation. In a dimly lit apartment near the heart of the city, Henri sat hunched over his desk, his fingers brushing over the worn-out edges of a faded map. He was a man of 57, too old for combat, too useful to arrest. His hair had grayed, his once broad shoulders now slightly slumped with age, but his eyes were still sharp. Those eyes had seen too much over the years, too much of the world's cruelty. A geographer by training, Henri had spent his life mapping lands, studying terrain, understanding boundaries. But now, in this bleak moment of history, he wasn't mapping countries or continents. He wasn't concerned with the borders of nations. He was mapping freedom. The quiet clicking of his pen broke the stillness of the room. Henry's hand moved swiftly over the parchment, drawing lines and circles, marking out routes, safe houses, hideaways, each one a potential escape for someone else. His maps weren't like the ones that filled the textbooks in classrooms. These were lifelines, fragile threads connecting a world of resistance to the faint hope of survival. With every stroke, he felt a deepening sense of purpose, mixed with the heavy burden of knowing that this work, his work, could endanger not only his life but the lives of the very people he was trying to save. He didn't have to look out the window to know what the streets outside were like. The air was thick with the scent of dread, the kind that clung to the walls of occupied cities. Henri knew the names of the streets, the alleys where resistance fighters hid, the back doors that led to underground tunnels. He knew where the eyes of the Gestapo lingered, where soldiers stopped to speak with informants. He knew where a false move could lead to death, and where one wrong name could lead to a betrayal that would ruin everything. The map before him wasn't just a tool for escape, it was an act of defiance. Paris, under Nazi control, had become a city of surveillance. But Henri wasn't just mapping escape routes for Jews or for the members of the French resistance. He was charting a way forward for those brave enough to fight back, for the men and women willing to risk everything to reclaim their dignity. He was mapping out the future of a people who had been silenced. He was, in a way, daring the Germans to see it, daring them to come for him. The room was cold. Henry's breath misted in the air as he paused, staring at the crisscross of lines he had drawn. It was more than just geography now. It was a desperate call for resistance, a refusal to submit to the unseen forces that sought to erase entire cultures. Henri wasn't a soldier. He didn't carry a rifle, nor did he ever train in the art of war. But in his heart, he understood the stakes. He knew that a soldier's greatest weapon wasn't always a gun or a grenade. Sometimes it was something as simple as a map. But maps, like the truth, could be dangerous things. A knock at the door made him freeze. His mind raced. Could they have found out? The Gestapo had eyes everywhere, and in times like these, everyone had a reason to be suspicious of their neighbors. Henri sat still, waiting. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, he rose from his chair and moved toward the door. His heart beat faster, his body tense as he reached for the handle. When he opened the door, it wasn't the soldiers. It was Claire, his neighbor, a young woman in her 20s with wide eyes filled with concern. Her dark hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, and her clothes were hastily thrown together as if she had been running. "Henri," she said, her voice trembling. "They're here. The Gestapo, just down the street. I saw them looking at your building." Henri didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment, though he hadn't expected it to come so soon. Claire didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet urgency. "They're coming for you, Henri. You know what they do to people like you, people who help the resistance. You have to go. Now." Henri looked down at the maps, spread out across the desk. His work wasn't finished, not even close. But the weight of the choice, the cost of his actions, hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. For a moment, he thought about leaving it all behind. He could slip out the back door, disappear into the night, and perhaps avoid the Gestapo's watchful eyes. Maybe he could start over, somewhere far away from the city that had become a battlefield for the soul. But that wasn't who Henri was. He had never been one to run from what was right, and he couldn't start now. "No," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I won't run. I'm not finished yet." He quickly grabbed the maps, folding them carefully and stuffing them into his coat. "Tell the others to go. They can't wait for me. The routes, the safe houses, they need them now. Go, Claire. Warn them." She hesitated but nodded. "I'll be back. You'll be safe. We'll find a way." Henri watched as she disappeared into the hall, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. He stood still, letting the silence fill the room once again. But it wasn't a silence of peace. It was a silence of waiting. He knew what was coming. He could hear the distant rumble of soldiers' boots on the street. Time was running out. Henri glanced at the map one last time, his eyes tracing the lines, the routes, the names of places that would soon become the thread connecting lives to survival. As he tucked the last of his papers into his coat and moved toward the back door, Henri couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about maps anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could change the course of the war itself. Maybe, just maybe, he could be a part of that change. March 3rd, 1943. Underground in Lyon, France. The city's heart beat differently now, quicker, sharper. The streets were more dangerous, more tightly controlled by the Nazi forces, yet there was an undeniable sense of something else pulsing beneath the surface: rebellion. The resistance had grown, and Henri's maps had become vital lifelines for those fighting against the occupation. They were no longer just scraps of paper hidden in attics or tucked into coats. They were becoming the thread that could unravel the fabric of oppression, a map to freedom for those brave enough to follow. In the shadows of Lyon's narrow streets, resistance fighters gathered in basements, warehouses, and hidden rooms, passing Henri's maps like treasure. Some were seasoned fighters, men who had long been fighting in the underground against the Germans. Others were ordinary civilians, students, shopkeepers, and even former soldiers who had once worn the uniform of the enemy. Now, they were all united in the same cause: the liberation of their country. They were all risking their lives for something far greater than themselves: freedom, justice, dignity. Among them was Jacques, a former prisoner of war who had spent months in a German prison camp before finally escaping, and Sophie, a young woman whose family had been torn apart by the occupation. They had all been drawn to the resistance by one thing: the idea that something, anything, could be done to stop the horrors unfolding around them. Henri's maps had become more than just tools for navigation. They were symbols of resistance, of hope. They were the roadmap for survival in a city where any wrong turn could mean a death sentence. Jacques unfolded one of Henri's maps carefully, his fingers trembling with both the weight of the task at hand and the fear of discovery. He traced his finger along the carefully drawn lines, each one marking a different escape route, a different potential refuge. "This one," he said, his voice low, "this will get us out of the city and toward the border. It's a narrow path, but if we move quickly, we can avoid the checkpoints." Sophie stood nearby, her brow furrowed as she studied the map. Her family had been torn apart by the war. Her father had been taken away by the Germans. Her brother was missing, presumed dead, and her mother was slowly dying from the grief of it all. Sophie had joined the resistance out of sheer necessity, out of a need to do something, to fight back. But each new mission, each new escape, brought a new weight, a new terror. The fear of being caught, the fear of losing another person, was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. "Do you think we can trust this?" she asked quietly, her eyes not meeting Jacques'. "I mean, how do we know Henri's maps are even safe? He's not a soldier. He's just a map maker. What if we're walking into a trap?" Jacques looked at her, his expression hardening. "We don't have a choice, Sophie. We trust Henri. He's the only one who's been able to create these routes. We have to trust that what he's given us is real." Sophie bit her lip, the weight of the decision settling on her. There was no turning back now. There never was. The room was filled with the low murmur of whispered conversations as others pored over the maps, making their plans for the next few days. Every moment was a moment too long in the city. The Gestapo were tightening their grip, raiding homes and businesses, looking for any hint of resistance. The stakes were impossibly high. The slightest mistake could spell their end. Jacques rolled up the map and stood up. "We leave tonight," he said, his voice firm. "We can't wait any longer. They'll find us if we do." Sophie nodded, steeling herself for the unknown. They had no illusions. They knew the risk they were taking, and it wasn't just the enemy they had to worry about. There were traitors in every corner of the city, informants who would sell them out for a handful of francs. Anyone could be watching. Anyone could be the enemy. As Jacques and Sophie gathered their gear, preparing to leave, Henry's map lay on the table like a silent witness to their courage. In its quiet lines, it held the stories of countless others who had risked everything. Henry's maps had become their guides, their lifelines. Yet, as vital as the maps were, they were also a constant reminder of the uncertainty they faced. Henri had mapped the escape routes, but they were still stepping into the unknown, trusting that the paths he'd drawn would lead them to safety and not into the jaws of the enemy. The small group of resistance fighters gathered their belongings, preparing to leave the safety of the hidden basement and enter the perilous streets above. Jacques looked at Sophie one last time, his gaze softening for just a moment. "We'll make it. We have to." They left together, emerging into the darkened streets of Lyon. The city, always alive with activity, now felt like a ghost town, its energy drained by the occupying forces. The lights were dimmed, the shadows lengthened, and the night air was thick with danger. Every step they took seemed louder than the last, the sound of their feet on the cobblestones betraying their every movement. But they pressed on, moving quickly, sticking to the shadows, following the route marked on Henry's map. They passed the old church where they'd hidden a stash of supplies and weapons just days before. The familiar landmark was now a reminder of everything they had to lose. As they neared the edge of the city, the tension was palpable. They could hear the occasional distant shout, the clatter of boots on the pavement, the sound of the Germans tightening their watch on every exit. At the final checkpoint, where the last few blocks of city stood between them and the open road, they stopped. Jacques pulled out Henry's map once more, checking their position. This was the final stretch. There was no room for error now. The safe house, the one marked on the map as their escape, was just ahead. But the streets were empty now, eerily so. No guards, no soldiers. Nothing. A strange calm fell over the group, and, for a moment, it felt like they might actually make it. Then, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots echoed from the far end of the street. Soldiers. They were close. "Move," Jacques hissed. "We have to go now." They ran, hearts pounding, legs burning with the effort. The door to the safe house loomed ahead. But just as they reached it, a shot rang out, echoing through the night. A bullet missed Sophie by mere inches, and the group scattered, panic overtaking reason. Henry's map was now more than just a guide. It was their salvation. Would it lead them to safety, or would it lead them into the jaws of the enemy, just as Sophie had feared? January 16th, 1945. Paris, France. The war had come to an end for much of the world, but for Henri, it had never really stopped. The echoes of battle had faded in the streets, replaced by the noise of soldiers clearing out, the relief of the liberated, and the quiet rumblings of rebuilding. Yet, Henri remained in the same small apartment where he had spent the last years of the occupation. The walls, once filled with the sound of his frantic pen scribbling on maps, now stood silent. The war had changed the world, but for Henri, it felt as though nothing had changed at all. He sat by the window, looking out over the city that had been both his prison and his purpose. The streets, now free, no longer carried the weight of fear. Yet in the silence of liberation, Henri felt as though something had been lost. The names of streets, the escape routes, the safe houses, everything he had drawn on those maps, were all fading into history, not with the recognition they deserved, but with the indifference of time. Henri had never been one for glory. But he had hoped, in his quiet way, that someone would remember, that someone would understand the price of the work he had done. But there was no celebration, no medal, no recognition. Henry's role in the resistance had been erased, forgotten in the rush of grander victories. He had saved lives, guided countless men and women to safety, but no one was there to tell his story. His maps, once the lifeblood of resistance networks across the country, had been swept aside as the pages of history turned. The resistance had become a narrative of grand heroes, men and women who had fought in the open, who had taken up arms and faced their enemies head-on. Henry had never fought in that way. His battles were quieter, subtler, fought with ink and paper, not guns and grenades. Yet, as Henry sat in the stillness of his apartment, there was no bitterness, just a quiet resignation. The work he had done was important. He knew that, but it had been done in shadows, and now, those shadows seemed to stretch further than ever. The city of Paris, the very city he had mapped countless times, was now indifferent to him. It had no place for a man who had fought his war with maps, not with military strategy. No place for a man who had spent the darkest years of the occupation in quiet defiance, offering his maps to those who had nothing but hope in their hearts. His apartment door creaked open, and Claire entered, her face a mixture of concern and uncertainty. She had been one of the few people who had known him during the war, one of the few who had survived to see the day the Germans left Paris. But even she, with all her respect for what Henry had done, seemed to carry the same weight of the unspoken truth. The resistance had been something to be remembered, but not the men who had worked quietly in the background. The unsung heroes had remained unsung. "I thought you might be here," Claire said, her voice soft but resolute. "I thought you might want to know. The war is officially over. The liberation is complete." Henry nodded, but said nothing. The words didn't carry the same weight they once might have. There was no celebration in the air, no sense of triumph. The streets outside were alive with activity, but Henry couldn't bring himself to join in. "I heard from some of the others," Claire continued. "The resistance is finally getting recognition, Henry. They're talking about the networks, the fighters, the men and women who gave everything. They're even naming streets after some of them. They're going to build monuments. It's all happening now. The world will know the names of those who fought." Henry didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew that no one would be talking about him. No one would speak of the quiet man who had spent years mapping escape routes, making plans, creating lifelines for people who would never know his name. Henry's work had been essential, but it had never been visible. There had been no grand speeches, no crowds cheering for the man who had used maps to outsmart the enemy. Henry had never expected fame, but he had hoped for something. Recognition, maybe. A simple acknowledgement that what he had done mattered. But even now, in the aftermath of it all, Henry was just a man who had lived through the war and done what he could, and now, after the world had moved on, he was nothing more than a footnote in a history that had already forgotten him. No one would remember the quiet work of cartographers who had guided countless souls to safety. There would be monuments to the fighters, the generals, the leaders. Henry's name would never be on one of those monuments. His face would never be etched into the stone of history. His maps, his legacy, would be lost to time.